In the 7th session on assessment and management of first episodes of psychosis, I'm going to talk about health issues that arise in first episode patients. Individuals with schizophrenia have a life expectancy that is 20 to 25 years briefer than general population. There are a number of risk factors for shortening their lifespan. They have high rates of smoking, obesity, and other things. But people with schizophrenia are most likely to die from cardiovascular disease. So we should look at ways to improve physical health and particularly cardiovascular health. A study in Denmark, which looked at drug-naive people with schizophrenia, found that they were 3 times more likely than the normal population to develop diabetes. These are drug-naive patients, so we're talking about a risk factor that's associated with having schizophrenia, not with its treatment. And some literature suggests that some of the susceptibility genes for type 2 diabetes are also associated with schizophrenia. When you put patients on an antipsychotic, the risk of developing diabetes increases an additional 3.6-fold. So you could see that being aware of these problems is really important in managing people with schizophrenia. This is from an early study in drug-naive first episode patients, which measured fasting glucose, insulin, and lipids. These patients had higher fasting plasma levels of glucose and insulin, suggesting that even before antipsychotic treatment, they were already becoming more insulin resistant. So preventing insulin resistance and diabetes should be part of the treatment plan, even at the very beginning of managing the illness. This chart shows the changes in body mass for young people treated with 3 antipsychotics, melindone, which is a first-generation antipsychotic, olanzapine, and risperidone. And each of those bars represents an individual and a percent increase in BMI. And this is during an 8-week trial. And you could see that whereas melindone was relatively weight neutral with more people losing weight than gaining weight, when you go to olanzapine and risperidone, you could see a real problem, particularly with olanzapine. And if you look at metabolic changes and focusing on olanzapine, you could see that it's associated with increases in triglycerides, LDL, and insulin levels. So these should factor into the selection of an antipsychotic. This is why the Schizophrenia Port, the patient outcome research team a few years ago, recommended that both clozapine and olanzapine shouldn't be the first antipsychotic a person receives, that this risk of metabolic effects from both of these antipsychotics was really too substantial. Clinicians during the early stages of treatment, and this is not just at a first episode for any patients, should be monitoring for signs of developing insulin resistance. It could be looking at lipid profiles and focusing on triglycerides, looking at fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C, and of course looking at whether patients have risk factors to start with. What to do when you see evidence during the first few weeks? Cochrane Review suggests changing an antipsychotic. If they're on one that promotes substantial weight gain, trying them to one that promotes less. If you see early evidence of weight gain, or even if you just see increases in triglycerides or hemoglobin A1C or fasting glucose, this is going to predict later elevations. And this could be a time to change antipsychotics. I'm going to talk about recommendations, but lifestyle interventions work and medications like metformin could be considered. So what I've tried to show you during this talk is that people with schizophrenia have a shortened lifespan, and that this seems to be related to both having a high risk of type 2 diabetes, which in turn is related to a high risk of cardiovascular disease. When we have first episode patients, we should carefully monitor them for evidence of weight gain and insulin resistance. And I'm going to talk in a subsequent lecture about effective medications and lifestyle interventions that should be considered when patients have these problems. Thank you very much.